So we'll be getting into Hebrews chapter 12, starting verse 12. But before we get going, let's start off with a question. Here it is, okay. What do you say to people when they say something along the lines of how you don't have to be saved to go to, you don't have to, how to say that? Going to church doesn't get you saved, or how you don't have to go to church if you're a Christian, that kind of stuff. They word it a lot of different ways, so, there's not one size fits all, but it's the same basic idea. I'm a good Christian, I just don't go to church, right? So what is your response? No wrong answers, by the way. Melissa, go ahead. Okay, so kind of a double thing there. You try to your understanding, because like of things like shut-ins and stuff, people obviously can't always go to church, but then also trying to encourage them to do it for the sake of just their own encouragement. Okay. Anybody else? How do you respond when people say that? Go ahead, Spencer. So in what you're saying here, you would agree that yes, going to church is not overly that essential. You can pretty much make anywhere a house of worship. Okay, all right. Anybody else? What do you say when people say this? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Is there something you say? Gracie, go ahead. Okay, so you're saying you're not necessarily opposed to it. It's just the attitude or mindset of why they're doing it. Okay, so you don't lean one way or another as far as. So you see church as, at least in a large part, kind of protective. Just a way of being, kept from stumbling is what you're saying, right? Kept from stumbling, like kind of a way to. Okay. All right. Anybody else? Shane, go ahead. So you're saying that in large part your faith can really grow more than it would have if you go to church. Okay. Anybody else? Now, we're not going to get into it, but it is, and this isn't to sway you one way or another, but it's interesting how many times in the New Testament we're told that certain people were excluded from the fellowship, and that was supposedly had some kind of negative connotation to it. And what all does that entail, and why was that important? And we're not going to look at it tonight, but it's definitely worth thinking about. Now, there's obviously the passage in Hebrews that everybody knows, don't forsake the gathering together. And you hear it kind of quoted a lot, especially by pastors. But the section that we're going to look at tonight actually talks about, I think, an area of necessity with the church that isn't overly emphasized too much, in the American context, I should say. And that is our responsibility to one another. And not just in the context of how I need the church, but also in the context of how the church needs me. So, oftentimes we do this. I'm a mature, strong Christian, so I don't need to go to church. Okay, if you're a mature, strong Christian, that's great. But other people in the church probably need you. And it's kind of flips it around because, the younger Christians do need us who are. So if you're saying you're strong and mature, so you don't need to go to church, that's all the more reason to go to church for those people who aren't strong and mature. And I think that's what we're really going to look at tonight. So, by way of review, in the last section we looked at, verses 3 through 11, we looked at basically the way that discipline or punishment from God is even if it's not deserved or if it's not fair, it's still for our good. And we looked at that through verses 3 through 11. So tonight we're going to pick up in verse 12 and read through verse 17. Is it okay if I have Chris read the whole thing? Is that okay?
Therefore, strengthen your tired hands and weakened knees, and make straight paths for your feet, so that what is lame may not be dislocated, but healed instead. Pursue peace with everyone and holiness. Without it, no one will see the Lord. Make sure that no one falls short of the grace of God, and that no root of bitterness springs up, causing trouble and defiling many. And make sure that there isn't any immoral or irreverent person like Esau, who sold his birthright in exchange for a single meal. For you know that later, when he wanted to inherit the blessing, he was rejected, even though he sought it with tears, because he didn't find any opportunity for repentance.
So as we get into this section, I want you to get rid of the idea that going to church every single time the doors are open makes you a good Christian. I want you to get rid of that. I want you to start looking at the church, as we're looking into this, as the early church saw the church. And that is a family for people who lost their family because they turned to Christ. It was an opportunity for them to come together, to join together, to be there for each other, to provide for each other. And it was an amazing dream. It was definitely a dream worth pursuing. I think sometimes we miss that in the modern context just because of the rise of, healthcare and we live in a very prosperous time and just a lot of different things. People are living longer, and I think we kind of lose a lot of what's going on here. But so let's look at this. In verse 12, it starts out. Did I finish that thought? Yeah, I did. So get rid of the idea of open and coming every time the doors are open and into more of an idea of coming to be as a family. Okay, I said that. So, okay, in verse 12 it says, therefore strengthen your tired hands and weakened knees. So, remember, whenever there's a therefore, look to see what it's there for. The last section we were looking at was the punishment and discipline of God and how it's actually for our good. So, since discipline is for our good, strengthen your tired hands. Since you're going through these trials, they're hard, but you know that they're for your good. Keep on keeping on. And he does that by quoting Isaiah 35, 5-8, which is where the strengthen your tired hands bit comes from. And we'll read that real quick. Strengthen the weak hands, steady the shaking knees. Say to the cowardly, be strong, do not fear. Here is your God. Vengeance is coming. God's retribution is coming. He will save you. Then the eyes of the blind will be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then the lame will leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute will sing for joy. For water will gush in the wilderness and streams in the desert. The parched ground will become a pool, and the thirsty land springs. In the haunt of jackals, in their lairs, there will be grass, reeds, and papyrus. A road will be there and a way. It will be called the Holy Way. The unclean will not travel on it, but it will be for the one who walks the path. Fools will not wander on it. Whenever you come to the New Testament quoting the Old Testament, just take a couple minutes and skip back over where they're quoting. Just kind of see what is being quoted. Because remember, they're not just quoting the words. They're quoting the idea, okay? So there's just a few words that they're going to have in that, and the New Testament passage, when you go back, you get the whole idea of what's being said. So in Isaiah 35, 3, verses 3 through 8, there's a basic idea, and that is, take heart. Punishment is not, I'm sorry, let's do this differently. In Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2, there's a basic idea. Take heart, the punishment is not the end of the story. And the whole idea of Isaiah 35, 3 through 8 is wait for God. There's a whole idea of this passage of Isaiah. Wait for God. You're waiting for his justice, you're waiting for his blessings. Basically, God won't leave it there. You're in this time of punishment. You're in this time of discipline. It's uncomfortable. God's not going to leave it there. He's got a plan for after that. He's going to bring something through it. So as it applies to the Hebrews, they're going through these struggles. They're going through this rough time. And he's quoting this passage from Isaiah that basically says, wait for God, and justice is going to come. God's not going to leave it here. You're in this place. It's uncomfortable. I don't know how long you're going to be here, but God will bring you out. And then he hops to verse 13, which says, and make straight paths for your feet, which is actually a quotation from Proverbs 4:26. So if we read that passage, which is verses 25 through 27, it says, let your eyes look forward, fix your gaze straight ahead. Carefully consider the path for your feet, and all your ways will be established. Don't turn to the right or to the left. Keep your feet away from evil. So we have this idea in Proverbs, which is basically saying live correctly. So we've gotten two things that they have told us here. Two responses to the punishment that the writer of Hebrews is saying. The first one, wait for God, and the second one, live correctly. To make straight your path is talking about to live holy, to live as God would have you live, to be holy. And so then we have two words that I want to focus as we're going through this. And that's at the end of this verse 13. So that what is lame may not be dislocated but healed instead. So make straight paths for your feet so that it was lame may not be dislocated, but healed instead. So there's two words used here that I want to focus on. The first is lame. The idea there is you're not doing too hot. You're running with a limp. And then the other one is dislocated. That's basically rather than healed, you've become incapacitated. So think about a runner. Maybe they've gotten a sprain or something. They're not doing too well, and they keep going, and it just turns really ugly, and now they can't even move. It's just really not good. So that's the difference between, we're kind of talking about it getting more intense. So the person who's already crippled or discouraged, it getting worse. And that lame, crippled thing can be anything. It can be a mentally taxed, physically ill, spiritually dry, emotionally exhausted. It's just that it's made worse by the response that they give to it. It's made worse by the response that they give to it. So in verses 12 through 13, we were told to wait for God. In verse 12 and in verse 13, we were told to live for him, that two-pronged approach there. And what would be the alternative to waiting for God? Well, giving up. What would be the alternative to living, making straight the pathway, living righteously? It doesn't matter how I live. I'm cursed if I do, I'm cursed if I don't. So I'm just going to do whatever because it just doesn't even matter. So the alternative isn't much better. And what happens if you do that is you're going to find yourself on a path that will hurt you. So in context, let's read verses 12 through 13 again. Therefore, strengthen your tired hands and weakened knees and make straight paths for your feet. Do this so that what is lame may not be dislocated. Because if you don't do those things, if you don't strengthen your tired hands, wait for God, and if you don't make straight paths for your feet, live righteously, then what is lame will be dislocated. You're going to basically running on a road that has a bunch of potholes in it, be tripping over it. The situation is going to go from bad to worse. So let's make it more practical about this. These Hebrews, they're suffering, they're struggling. If they wait for God and live righteously, they can bounce back as they wait for God and live righteously. But if they give up, the situation is going to go from bad to worse, and they're going to be dislocated. It's not going to be good. So verse 14 then says, pursue peace with everyone and holiness without it no one will see the Lord. And you get to this verse, and it kind of seems like, huh? Does this have anything to do with the verses we just read? How does this have anything to do with it? But and there's the obvious themes that you could say, like, okay, well, be holy and struggling, that kind of carries over. But I think it's much more than that. I would say this: what is the natural reaction that we have in times of stress and troubles? I would say that it's probably twofold. First off, we lash out at other people, don't we? You have a bad day at work, you come home and bite your wife's head off, right? Don't we do that? Or your husband, for the women who work. What happens when you're in times of prolonged stress with your relationship with God? Well, usually you kind of slack off. I just need a little bit of me time. I'm just gonna skip reading the Bible for tonight. I just need to decompress. I'm just gonna watch some trash TV and just zone out. I just need some time to decompress. You know what I mean? That's the natural reaction to stress. But as we look in these verses, he's saying something that we should do instead of that. So he said, let's tie things together. Verse 12 and 13, he said about strengthening your hands, making straight the path. What does it mean to make straight that path? What does it mean? A straight path isn't just my heart inside. See, sometimes we get the idea that Christianity is like a private thing. My religion is like private, So it's what's going on in my heart. But it's how I treat others that shows what's happening in my heart. My religion is not a private affair. It is a public affair. It's a social affair. It's a communal affair. See what I mean? My faith is shown by my life in the community. And these are some big ideas here. So I can make my struggles worse, for instance, by how if I mistreat my wife, the Bible says that God won't answer my prayers. So if I'm going through a time of struggle and I get stressed and I take it out on my wife, God's not going to answer my prayers. The situation is going to get worse. See what I mean? So then he says in verse 14, pursue peace with everyone and holiness. Without it, no one will see the Lord. And we start to see the connection. We definitely start to see the connection. That if I am making straight my path, I am going to be pursuing peace with people and living holy. So in your struggle, wait for God and live correctly, but also watch how you react, okay? Which is going to come out with how you treat people and how you treat God. So if you look at a lot of the biggest claims with religion, you're going to find this is often overlooked. In true religion, it has a God element and it has a people element. Okay? This is why gossip is a big deal and smoking is not really a big deal. You're going to hear people talking a lot of, especially in older, more traditional churches, don't smoke, don't smoke. Smoking is not going to send you to hell. It won't. Gossip will absolutely destroy a church, though. See what I mean? And gossip is a big deal, whereas smoking isn't, because gossip has a direct relation with people, with how you're treating people. And smoking really doesn't that much. So in the modern context, a lot of times there's a lot of people who say, I'm spiritual, but they don't have these two dynamics of holiness with God and then peace or outreach with men. So what happens is we tend to go to one or two extremes. The first extreme is humanitarianism. I'm going to provide clean water for people in Africa. It doesn't matter if they're saved. It doesn't matter what their eternal salvation is. Just as long as I provide them clean water, they can go to hell with clean water. But then the other extreme is legalism. I don't need to help those those who need help. They only need salvation. So I'm only going to preach the gospel and just forget about giving them food, forget about giving them water. And James actually talks about this. He says, "What good is your faith if it's not matched by works?" You say, oh, but then you're not providing for those in need. How is that true religion? So there is definitely that two bits to it. And true religion has true faith, which, remember, that's what we were just talking about. In chapter 11, that whole thing was about faith. And now he's talking about, once again, true faith and how that faith causes us to not just change how we treat God, but how we treat others, which is really the root of all of the book of Leviticus, for instance. And if you read through James says pretty much the exact same thing as well. James and Hebrews are pretty much mirroring each other here. So when we read through verse 14, it said, "Pursue peace with everyone and holiness. Without it, no one will see the Lord." What is the it? Is it the pursuing peace or the holiness? Well, first off, it is singular, and it is definitely talking about the holiness, not the pursuing peace with everyone. And so you might say, so hold on. It's important that we pursue peace with people, but our relationship with God is a little bit higher, right? Well, yeah, actually, yes. So the idea here is that how we treat others comes out of our holiness. Basically, I don't conjure in myself to be a good person, and so I treat other people well so that I can be a good person and God can look at me with favor because I'm a good person. That's not how it works. We have a relationship with God that then feeds into how I treat people. It comes out of that, flows out of that. We're not doing humanitarian things so that we can feel better about ourselves and, we're serving other people because we love God. We have a cause for it. Religious people, for instance, are much more likely to volunteer for efforts such as humanitarian aid than atheists, for instance. So, when he says here, without it no one will see the Lord, obviously he's talking about in a positive way, because everybody's going to see the Lord at the time of the judgment, aren't they? But he's not talking about you're not going to see him at all. He's talking about you're not going to see him show up in the situation. You're not going to see the positive benefits of him in that situation. So verse 15 goes on to say, make sure that no one falls short of the grace of God and that no root of bitterness springs up, causing trouble and defiling many. So that takes us to the question of how do we pursue peace and holiness? How do we do this thing that this verse told us to do? Well, it comes down to three things. See to it, if you've got some translations, or the CSB says make sure that. Three things. First thing, that no one falls short. That's someone in the body is missing God's grace. They're missing God's forgiveness. They're rejecting the gospel. See to it that we don't, none of us goes off and rejects the gospel. That's the first thing he says here. And this actually comes from, then the second thing comes from Deuteronomy 29:18, which says, be sure there is no man, woman, clan, or tribe among you today whose heart turns away from the Lord our God to go and worship the gods of those nations. Once again, bringing up the idea of people being maybe pushed out of the church. Be sure there is no root among you bearing poisonous and bitter fruit, and that poisonous and bitter fruit would be once again the idol worship and the apostasy. So the first thing we saw from the beginning of verse 15, which said, make sure that no one falls short of the grace of God and no root of bitterness. So the first thing is make sure that no one falls short of the grace of God. The second thing is that no root of bitterness spring up, which once again is from Deuteronomy. And so the idea of the second thing is make sure that this isn't happening, that somebody's rejecting the gospel. Let's say, Spencer, you're my example. And then in so doing, they are now contaminating somebody else. So maybe you're close to, obviously, Terry, but let's say you're close to Melissa and Jason too. So now you're starting to have a negative effect on them too. So it's not just make sure that this doesn't happen among you, but also make sure that in it happening, it's not spreading to others. So we're talking about kind of a chain reaction. Which obviously negatively impacts the body. Whenever there's a sin like that, it negatively impacts. And I want to take just a brief little detour here and mention something about bitterness. And that's that bitterness, we always think we can hold on to these attitudes either in ways that God has wronged us or people have wronged us, and that it's not going to come out. That somehow we can just hold on to it and it's going to be okay. My dad wronged me when I was a kid, and so all these stories. And I have no doubt that people have really, really genuine stories that they're totally true. I bet that's a bad situation you say that you went through. I bet you really did go through it, absolutely. But here's the thing about bitterness: bitterness always affects relationships with God. First off, it will always come in there, and eventually you're going to find yourself cursing God from that bitterness from your heart. I've seen a lot of people who got really bitter. Actually, there's someone in particular who's coming to my mind. The situation, it was a bad one, I'm not going to lie. So they got a divorce, and eventually it came out in bitterness towards God, where they were saying snide things about God because of that bitterness that was in their heart. It traveled to God. It always happens like that. And also vice versa, when you have bitterness towards God, it's going to rub off on your human interactions. But so bitterness always affects your relationship with God, but it also affects your relationship with other people. If I'm bitter towards my wife and I don't get over it, it's going to start coming up towards maybe other women in the church, maybe all women. Maybe I'm going to start not liking any women. See what I mean? And it's going to spread to different people because I have that little bitterness. And it obviously can spread to men too. I'm not saying anything about that, but it has a way of just spreading like that. And also, when we hold on to the bitterness, it pollutes other people in the church. The attitude spreads. And that's really what he's talking about here in Hebrews 2, the way that it does that. So when we're talking about this passage here, which said, the quote from Deuteronomy about no root among you bearing poisonous and bitter fruit from Deuteronomy, it's important to note that he mentions the two things, idolatry and apostasy. Idolatry is the worship of other gods. Apostasy is falling away from the one true God. So these two things are basically the same thing. They're basically the same thing. If you're falling away from God, you might not word it like this, but you really are falling into worship of something else. It can be another god, or it can be money, or your success, or science, or it can be anything. But, we as people, we always normally worship something. It's going to come out in worship towards ourselves, worship towards a thing. It really doesn't matter what it comes out to, but it's going to come out to something. So idolatry and apostasy really are normally pretty much the same thing. And apostasy corrupts and defiles other people. Okay. And then we get to verse 16 that says, and make sure that there isn't any immoral or irreverent person like Esau. So I told you a couple weeks ago we were going to follow up with an example of a person. We've finally come up to the example of Esau. It just took us a couple weeks to get there. So this brings us to the third thing of the make sure that's. No one falls short, and then it said that others aren't soiled, and then we get to the third thing, that there isn't immorality. And that there's no immoral or irreverent person. So if you look at this list that he gave us from these verses here, you can clearly see there's a progression, can't you? There's a very obvious progression that we looked at. No one falls short. So this is talking about beliefs, right? That someone stops believing, they go astray from their faith. Their belief is altered, which then goes to interactions with other people. So we went from belief to community, and then we get to the third thing, that there isn't immorality, actions. See, our actions, this is what we always look at with things. Oh, look at my actions or whatever, but it always starts with a belief that then turns into other things. For this reason, you can tell people about whether they are genuine or not by the company that they keep and the fruit of their life. So if you've got a pastor or anything like that, look at the company that they keep and the fruit. They can talk really good from a stage, but I tell you what, look at the fruit and look at the company that they keep. This is a clear way of showing false teachers too. And we're going to get more on that on Sunday, so don't worry too much about that. Put that in your back pocket or whatever. But so that you can see this clear progression that happens in the church and causes a root of bitterness here that causes things to spread. And you might say, now hold on. This verse here said, and make sure that there isn't any immoral person like Esau. What? How is Esau immoral? And if you stop and think about the story, you're going to have a hard time pointing to one example of sexual immorality with the guy. And then you might remember one little thing it says in passing, and that's that he married these 2 Hittite wives. And that's what it's talking about. That's the sexual immorality. And because of it, it displeased his parents very greatly. And it developed into a Jewish, basically a Jewish doctrine or belief about the way that Esau was sexually immoral. And so then we get down to Hebrews, which is obviously hundreds of years of theology in the making, where he says that that Esau was sexually immoral. And then he says the second thing, that there isn't any immoral or irreverent person like Esau. Irreverent basically just means unholy. So basically, Esau was not living as he should. And the idea here is that Esau sold his inheritance for a short, temporary, quick gratification. He would rather be instantly pleased than have a prolonged blessing. He who sold his birthright in exchange for a single meal. Jacob, on the other hand, seemed to grasp the weight of it. So in the context of Hebrews, there's an obvious, transfer here. This would be equivalent to them giving up salvation just to have a little temporary peace for this moment. We can go back and just give up Jesus, go back to the whole Jewish thing and just Be done with it. Be done with the problem. And so obviously the what's it called? Not analogy, but it wouldn't be lost on them. Anyways, so then we get to verse 17, which really wraps up the idea of Esau trading the eternal for temporary. 17 says, "For you know that later when he wanted to inherit the blessing, when he cared, he was rejected. Even though," and this is a very important part of this verse, "even though he sought it with tears because he didn't find any opportunity for repentance." He sought it with tears, still there were no forgiveness. So there's a lot of things here, and I'm going to try to keep things brief. We're about done. He rethought it later. He rethought what he was doing later, but it was too late. In the same way, the Hebrew audience is doing the same thing. Let's just go back. Let's just go back. We can just forget the whole Jesus thing. Let's go back to the whole Jewish thing. And he's saying, well, you're going to rethink this later. It's probably going to be too late then. And there's a lot of reasons why that could happen. I don't think he's saying because you won't be able to ask for forgiveness later, your falling away is final. I don't think he's saying that. I think what he's saying is basically you don't know when your final opportunity is. I mean, you don't know, especially back then. I mean, people lived way shorter than we do now, and had all kinds of different problems that they came into, which I'm not saying we don't have problems, but, Esau didn't seek the birthright until Jacob had already received it. When you read through the story, pay attention to that. Jacob says, I'll give you this soup if you give me your birthright. He does. And then some time passes, and Jacob goes to Isaac to get the blessing. And then Esau goes to try and make a claim for it, after Jacob had already cashed in his chips. He waited until Jacob had already closed the deal before he tried to get it back. So there's a few things we see here. Yeah, you can be bitter and unaware. We saw that before in the verse before. But you can also get emotional and cry without repenting. Getting emotional about something, shedding tears, absolutely you can have that without there actually being repentance. And second to that, I would also say this, that in the context of Hebrews 12:17, the word repentance is more of the idea of reversal. So Esau went to his father Isaac and asked him to bless him, and he said, "But I thought I just blessed you." And he said, "No, this is not good. Bless me also." But Isaac couldn't bless him. There was nothing else to bless him with. And he also couldn't turn the blessing around because it had already been done. So he wanted a reversal of the situation. He wanted a repentance of the situation. So in the context of 12:17, that's what he's talking about. Even though he sought it with tears because he didn't find any opportunity for repentance, you couldn't turn back. The blessing was already given out. So when you harden your heart, there's no telling that it will ever change. And a lot of times you'll be dealing with people in ministry and trying to, people have a way of just really sticking their nose and getting real hard about something, and you can try to, but if somebody has their mind made up, there's not much you can say one way or another. I mean, if they have their mind made up, that's just the way of it. I've seen sometimes when people are in marital discord, let's just say, and you're trying to talk to them, and you see there's a certain look in their face. They've already decided to have this divorce. Anything I say is just falling on deaf ears. They've already decided. They've already made this decision. You know what I mean? But then there's other times when you're talking, you can see there's still a little bit of a struggle. And when people get to that point of making up their mind, that's kind of how it is. And so what I'm saying here with the whole Esau part is these Hebrews that were considering going back to Judaism, if they harden their heart, there's no telling if their heart would ever get unhard again. Do you know what I mean? They were receptive to Jesus at one time, but if they harden their heart and walk away from it, they might not ever be receptive to it again. Not that God couldn't save them, but just that the situation won't go in their favor. So when we look at all this, one last thing to say is this, that Hebrews teaches us in verses 12 through 17 of chapter 12, it teaches us one of the aspects that we are responsible to one another. The church isn't just a place where we come and worship. And I think this is one of the most off-putting things in the modern culture, because people want to live however they want to live. But the context of the church is supposed to be people who are responsible to one another. We're responsible for encouraging for one another, but also, in a way, we do have to answer to one another. In a way, obviously not. There's a way to take that to a dark realm. You don't have to live your life for other people. That's what I'm saying. And you don't have to, step on eggshells around people. That's not what I'm saying. But there is the sense of, in sin, the idea of the church is to help us so we don't get into sin, because we are here for one another. Like, hopefully, the idea is that if my board saw, me getting into a sin, that they would talk to me and try to pull me out. And if I was not willing, that then there'd be, action with the district. Same thing with if I saw one on my board doing something, right? There's that accountability, that responsibility. And it's not just true for leadership, it's also true for us one-on-one. We are watching out for one another. It's not just about what I can get from church, it's about what I can give to church. And one of the things that we see in verses 12 through 17 is that idea of how we're responsible to one another. Make sure that there's not someone who rejects the faith among you, who's defiling other people and is now becoming immoral. Watch out that this isn't happening. So, if we summarize all these things that we looked at, I think we could say it like this. Faith requires a God element and a people element. It requires it. If you have a religion that just has a God element, that's not really a religion. That's an emotional thing. It makes you feel good. There's no depth to it. But if it's just a people thing, then it's not really a religion either. It's more of just a good service you do to other people. It has to have both those things for it to really be faith. So are there any questions about anything we looked at tonight? Nope. Okay, we're getting towards the end of Hebrews. Some really good parts in here. If you guys think of anything later, please put it in the box, and we can get to it next week if you want, or we can get to it in the end of October, either or.